Welcome back to our fourth tutorial in our series Blender for Production, the Compositor. My name is Helge from pixeltrain. After we've seen now in the last tutorial, in tutorial number 3, how we work with render layers, view layers, and also with render stats, I now want to use this new knowledge to really configure the scene so that we can use it in the next tutorial for the final compositing. And I'm back now in a full structure here. So you see I have no collections at all. I deleted all my view layers here so that we can start fresh. And if you have the feeling that you don't understand something, what we are doing now, please refer to the tutorial number 3, where I explained a lot about view layers and the render layer system. So this here is a refresher and also a preparation. So let's get started here. And the first thing I want to do here is I want to split my scene, because I want to use a system, for example, where I have 3 render layers later. One render layer for the moving objects, one render layer for my environment, which is here the ramp and also the floor, and one render layer for the emissive light, because this light here is a mesh light. It's really bright. We have seen in one of the first compositor tutorials in this series that we later have in compositing a white value of 15 for that here. And this makes problems in some of the nodes in the compositor. So I think it would be a good idea to have these emissive lights in its own render layer so that we only can use them, for example, for glare effect or whatever. So this is the basic idea. And to make the render layers later, we first have to make good collections. So let's talk about the collection process here really briefly. Like I've said, we want to split everything, and my idea here is that we split first the objects, the environments, lights, and the emissive lights in their own collections, so that we then can build the render layers out of them. So let's run through that here. So the objects will be these 2 guys here. So I select these 2 here and press the M key for move to collection. Then we go to new collection and we say this collection is objects, for example. Okay, that's done. And you will see that we have now here our new collection. Objects are inside of this collection and they are vanishing here from the scene collection. They are moved to this collection here. Great. Next thing is the environment, which will be the ramp and the floor. Press the M key after selecting new collection. Environment. Second one, move to collection, works fine here. And now comes the lights, and we have here an area light and this ring here, which is the mesh light. M again, new collection, lights. So everything fine until this point. Now comes our first problem we have to solve. Like I've said, later I want to separate the top light, which is this ring here, and I want to have it on its own render layer. So we need a collection which is hosting it. But the only collection where we have top light at the moment is lights. So we have to have this top light in its own collection again. And to do that, we want to use linking. So we link now this thing to collection. We have talked about that in the last tutorial. So I select now my top light here. And instead of pressing M, like move to collection, which will remove this top light from the lights collection and move it into the new collection, we use Shift M, which is link to a collection. So we get now a link, new collection here, and we say that this collection is emissive lights. And now you see that top light is now 2 times in the list. And these 2 lights here are linking to the same data block. So 2 times here the same light, and later we can tell, oh, I don't want to see lights here. I only want to see emissive lights. And you see, this is then the result. So this is a good test which you can now do. You can think about, okay, what do I want to have separate? For example, only the objects here. So I deactivate all these here, and then we have only the moving objects here in our list. Then we want to have the environment separate. Okay, click this. Then we have the environment here. And then we have the lights, which are both of them. And we also have the emissive lights. Great. I think the preparation is done. Now we can talk about the render layers. And for this, make sure that you have all the toggles here on. If you don't have them on, remember, you go here into this menu here, and under restriction toggles you can activate here visible in viewport, rendering, holdout, and indirect only. So everything is activated here. Great. So let's make our render layers. You know that render layers are hosted here, and you see in my case, my render layer, which I have here in the list, is named all. The reason for this is that I used the same file like last time. In your case, maybe you have a render layer with has the name view layer, so you can rename it here. Click here into the field and type all, and that's it. So the render layer all, or better to say the view layer all, now I have to be a little bit more precise, is my standard layer where I want to work. So I don't want to render it all, for example. And for my real render layers, I will have a special naming convention. So let's make a new one. I click here on this little icon. I say I want to have a new view layer. And I name this now RL underscore for render layer. So I can later see what is a render layer and what is a layer which I used, for example, for scene organization or whatever. So all my render layers have RL as a prefix, and the first render layer is moving objects. Okay, and now we can decide what we want to have on the layer. So make our first attempt. You will see we have to come back here. I only want to have the objects here, and I don't want to see the environment, the lights, and the emissive lights. So I select these three here and press the E key, like exclude on the keyboard. You also can make a right mouse button click, go here to view layer and say disable from the view layer. And there you see the keyboard shortcut. So everything is gone. Moving objects are there. Great, everything is done. Now we run into a problem. Let's test this really briefly. I go here now into my camera, 0 key on my numpad, and I try to test it here in the viewport, otherwise we have to render. So test this here, and you will see we don't see anything anymore. What's the problem? The problem is that our lights here are needed for seeing our objects. But if I activate now the lights here in this render layer, you will also see the emissive object, which I don't want. So we want that this collection here is indirect visible. So the light and the reflections is something we want to see, but not the primary visibility. And to do that, we have to make this active again, and then we have to set this to indirect. You can do it two ways. You can make a right mouse button click, go to view layer here and say set indirect only, or you can tick here this little arrow, and now you see everything is gone, but you still see the reflections here of the light source in the top and also the light source from the right here. That's indirect, and that's absolutely the thing we want. Another thing, if we now scrub a little bit farther, we see here now comes the point where we normally have the ramp, and if we now are here on the floor, we will have light here from the floor, and you see this is missing. And the same thing here. We have to go here to environment, activate this again to get here these light bounces and reflections, but then we go here to the environment and say I want to have this only indirect. So now this here is gone, and you will see that in the viewport we have these black areas here, but you will see in the rendering they are really gone. Now let's test this. We go out here back into our material preview, and one thing I have also to do is if we now are here on a view layer and we have two of them, all and this view layer, if we now tick render, Blender will render both layers sequentially. So we first have to render all, and then we render this render layer, and then the compositor will kick in and do this magic. So we remove this stuff. First thing is I go to the compositor and deactivate use nodes. So the compositor will do nothing. And then the next step would be I go in the render layer moving objects here into the view layer properties. And here we say render a single layer. So we only see the layer which we are rendering here. So let's save this for now and press render, and we wait a moment. And you see we are on moving objects at the moment, and that's the final result of the rendering. And I think it looks good. We see the reflections here of the light source and also here the bounce light. So this was the configuration of our first render layer, moving objects. So I go out with escape, make a new layer now here. And the next render layer we want to have, rl_stays, is environment. Okay, this is the environment. And let's think about what we want to see. We don't want to see the objects, and we have to think about the lights, but the objects is the same thing. You remember, we have reflections of these things here, and we need the reflections later. So instead of making the objects on this environment layer invisible, we say directly indirect. And now you see, if I render this now, we see here the reflection, then also here are these shadows, but not the objects anymore. And then we go here to emissive light. We don't need that at all. So this is something we really can exclude here from the list. Why? Because the top light is in both collections here, so in lights and here. So this is okay. But this here we need, again, indirect. And that's it. This is the preview. Like I've said, it's not 100% accurate, so go out here. Render single layer is still on for the environment. Let's test this. Okay, let's make a short test here. Go here, go a little bit back here. And you see that we have a little problem here, that it looks good, but the ramp is not there. So what's going on here? That's a problem if you use the same file for many steps here. So maybe this ramp is not visible because you've set a render stat on it. Let's take a look here. I select this, and you remember that the render stats are here under the object properties. And you see here under visibility, ray visibility, that I have deactivated the ray visibility here for the camera. So the camera doesn't see the thing, but all the rest. So let's activate that again, and let's test the whole thing again. And now we have an environment which makes more sense. And we see here the shadows of the moving objects. This is fine. I think it's done here. Okay, and the third render layer which we now need is the emissive light. So this is emissive light. And what we don't want to see are the lights, because emissive light is only the top light. We can click this here on so that we see what's going on. And the other objects are not important for the light source itself in this case. So let's go to this point here and think about what's happening now. So if we go here to environment, deactivate that, that's okay. We never have a problem here. But if we now deactivate that here, you will see that we suddenly have here an area of this light where normally we don't have any lights. So this time we can't only use that here, because indirect is still that here. So if you're not sure, test this. So render this, and you will see the ring is complete. What I want is, I want to have here a hole where the moving objects are, because we need this hole later, because normally we can't see behind this ring. So to change that now, what we can do is we go now here to the objects and say that we want to have them here. I deactivate here the indirect as an holdout. So let's render this here again. And now you see that we get here a black hole where the objects are occluding the ring. And that's exactly what we later need. So this is the work of a holdout. So let's go out here of this system again, and yeah, let's check again if everything is right now. So let's go here through the list. So we have the moving objects, we have the environment, in the environment, the ramp. Let's check this again only to make sure the ray visibility is there. Now everything is done here, hopefully. And what I now can do is I make a first test before I go into final rendering and maybe find then a problem. So what I do now again here is I want to have now everything rendered. I go back to compositing here and I remove this glare here. And we first have to activate the use the nodes. So Control X, okay. And we only have one render layer at the moment. So this is something we have to change now. And you see we had the render layer all active before. So how to remove now this render layer all, that it's rendered, and we want to render all these three here as a sequence. To do that, we go back here now into the view layer settings. And you remember we set here render a single layer. Now we want to render everything. But you also see that there's a flag which is named use for rendering. So every of these view layers here has this flag. So I go now in here and say I want to have the render layer all, or better to say the view layer, and I say I don't want to render it at all. Then we deactivate use render single layer, and now you see this is a flag which is then here on every of these view layers. So now everything is set up, all would be not rendered, and because we don't have set render single layer here, all these three layers here are now rendered. So let's save and go here to render and say render image, and we now have to wait. So first comes the moving objects, then the environment here, and then the emissive part, and then the composite kicks in, and the composite is empty at the moment. Great. Let's switch here to the composite view. And what we now do is we want to address them. So take your render layers node. If you don't have one, go here to the inputs, render layers. And now we say what we want to see. We want to have the moving objects here. That's this layer here, great. Then I select this node, Shift D, make a new connection here, set the node wrangler, Control Shift click here to this render layers node, and we want to have the environment here. Here we are, great. And then Shift D, we want to have the emissive light here. And this looks like that here. Now you see we have all three of these layers here together. Now we want to test if we can composite these three together so that we exactly get what we want. So to do that now, we go into my quick favorites. You remember we set that up in our first tutorial, and we say I want to have an alpha over here. And what we want to have is I want to have here these here connected. So let's start with these two here. So the background here is that here. So I bring this to the first port here, and this here is something we want to have in front. So let's switch this over and tell now the system we want to use that here, and it doesn't seem to work correctly. Now, where is the problem? If we bring this down here, we will see that the mixing here seems to be correct. Great. But if you now take a look here, it seems that the alpha doesn't work. So let's check the alpha. To do that, Control Shift, and I click here on the moving objects here onto the alpha. And you see the alpha is completely white. So we don't have a separation of these objects here. And the reason for this is that the cycle's background is not transparent by default. The same here, if you go to this alpha here or this alpha, you see everything is white. So you can't mix these here. So let's re-render the whole thing, but this time correct. I go here into here the render properties, and we go then here to the film. And here we see we can set the film here to transparent. And now we save and click render again. And that's the coolest thing here in the whole system. So it renders now, and now you see we have an alpha. You see it here in the image viewer. Great. And we don't have to re-import something like that or so. We switch here back now to our composite view, and look at that. Now we have alphas here going on. And if we now go to an alpha over, you now see now they are stacked correctly. And now we can also stack here now our light source onto the whole thing. So let's take another alpha over and remember that this here is the background. So it's the first input. So in our case, this here maybe is the background. And this here is the foreground because we mix it with a factor of 1 over it. So let's check this. And now it looks like that here. Looks good for me. What happens if we switch here the inputs? This would be an interesting thing. So let's select this node, and if you press Shift W, because you have the node wrangler active, you can see here this little menu here. And there is a swap links, so Alt S. And if you swap this now here, you will see that it doesn't matter. The reason for this is that we don't have here contacts at all. So that's the reason here why this works. But this is the work I normally do before I make a big render. I first test if I can comp everything together in one image. And if you have set everything correct and you have the feeling, yeah, I have everything, then you make your final render. And the cool thing is you don't lose this comp here because you can renew the whole thing, or also you can renew only one layer. If you click here this little render the active scene, then you get a new render here. So let's talk about the passes we want to have in the whole thing. You see at the outputs here we have image, we have alpha, we have depth here. If we click that here, we have a depth information. And to see that, make a right mouse button click and move here over the scene, and then you see suddenly where the objects are. You have values here going on. So these values are super bright. So that's the reason why you don't see them, but they are there. If you press Ctrl Shift A, you remember we made there a keyboard shortcut for the search dialog. And we go here and say we want to have a normalized node. And then we take here depth, for example, and bring it in here. You see now the depth channel here is normalized, so values between 0 and 1. And now you see this is the information of the depth channel here, which we have. So this is an information we have, and then we have the noisy image here. If you now want to have more of that, so Ctrl X to remove that, we have to go on the different layers here and set what we want. So let's do that here. Under Emissive light, what do we want to have as layers? So let's go here into the list, and we have combined and set, that's okay. And what's important for me is, for example, I want to have here an emissive pass. And if you tick this here, you see that suddenly here the pass comes as an output. But doesn't mean that it has information yet. So if you now look into this, you see there's no information at all. If you want to test this now, you can click here render, and then you see this layer is now rendered really fast. Let's go back here to the compositor, and now you have here the emit output here, which you now can use, for example, like I've said, glow or whatever. So it's a really good check here what's going on, and it's a really fast way to render only this render layer by clicking here. So I think that's enough here for the emissive light. So let's talk here about this render layer, which are the moving objects, and to later show you in the next tutorial a little bit more about image passes and data passes. We will add them completely. So let's go in here. We have the Z channel, which is a depth from the camera. So it's really a calculation how far something is from the camera. Keep in mind that this here is only really working if you don't have depth of field or motion blur calculated into the image, because this is only one sample. So if we have something with motion blur, for example, and you want to have the distance, you also can add the mist pass. And the mist pass inside of Blender is a normalized pass, so it's between 0 and 1. And if you use a mist pass, you have to set the distance in your scene. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Let's take a really fast look what I mean with that. If you go here to your 3D viewport and you look into your scene, you have here a camera. And maybe you know that if you want to see the limits of the camera, so what the camera sees and where the focal point is, you can select the camera, go here to the camera settings, go here to viewport display, and then a little bit deeper here to limits. And if you activate that here, you now see this line here. And these are the limits of the camera. And here's a little cross. And this cross is normally, if you render in camera, the depth of field, the focal point. We will talk about this process in the next tutorial when we work with depth of field in the post process. But the reason why I want to show you this little cross here is that if you go here to depth of field, you see this is the distance. And if you now take this cross and move it around, you see the distance of this cross here in this scene here. And like I've said, if you have a mist pass, you have to calculate it correctly. Let's take a look what a mist pass looks like. If you go now to the render view here and look through the camera, it's important, and then you open up this list here, you see that in the viewport we can see render passes. Cool. And if you open this up, you see here is the mist pass. And if you select this now, you now see that the mist pass is between 0 and 1, and you have here now your object. And the important thing is we have to make sure that because it's a clamped thing between 0 and 1, everything which we need later is in this range. And if you don't find the right values, this mist pass doesn't do the right job. Let's demonstrate that. And go here now to the world settings, then go to the mist pass, and now you see the mist pass is now calculated from 5 meters in front of the camera to 30 meters into the scene. And if you now want to check what it is, let's test this. I start here, for example, in 5 meters, but I stop here after 10 meters. And now you see the mist pass is mostly white and you don't see the second object anymore. So because it's only 10 meters, let's take a look here in the 3D viewport, and I deactivate now the mist pass really fast. You see, if I go to 10 meters, let's go to the camera and check. If I now go here, you see 10 meters are around here. And like I've said, this is the problem. So what I normally do now is I take this cross and I check how deep the scene is. And I check this, and I think here the scene is really complete. So I never want to use values behind this here. And it's around 29 meters. And that's exactly what I wanted to know. So there are other ways of calculating this, but yeah, that's my way. So 29 meters, I go here and say, I want to have a depth with 29 meters. And if we go back here now, go to the mist pass again, you now see that everything which I'm interested is in these gray value areas, and then the mist pass is useful later. So let's go back here to the preview, go back to the layers. Then we can have a normal pass and a UV pass. So the UVs on the object, the normals on the objects. Vector pass is for motion blur. So cool thing. If you want to denoise, you can tick it here. We talked about this in one of the last tutorials, so I don't use it. I don't use the object indices here. We talked about that also in the last tutorial, so don't use them here. Then we have the light passes, which we want to use in the next tutorial. So for the direct lighting, for the glossiness, transmission, we have nothing where light transmits through an object, so it's not important. Volume, we don't have one. And emissive, this here is not emissive, so we don't need that. Environment, we don't need, but ambient occlusion and shadows. It's maybe a good idea to have that. And yeah, our friends, the cryptomats, it's a good idea to have them. And that's the reason why I don't use the ID passes here. So I use object and material. And yeah, that's now the job for you. A little reminder here, we also have here under filter and override some more options. So you can deactivate for this render layer, ambient occlusion or environment, or you can remove, for example, real surfaces shading, hair shading or volume shading. And you can also have a material override and a sample override if you need. So there are more specialties here. If you want to know more about that, make a right mouse button click here on this text. And there you have the online manual where you can switch into that if you need that. So let's go to the next thing. We go to the environment. And in the environment, I want to have the same light passes. So same things here. I want to have that here. I want to have shadows on that. And yeah, I think that's good. UVs, yeah, vector. We don't have motion blur here, but maybe it's okay. Normal vector UVs. Everything is here. And then the last one was the emissive light. We had this, so the moving objects is set up correctly. Environment is set up correctly. And the emissive light. Yeah, let's make a mist. I don't know why I should use it, but yeah, maybe we will use it. And yeah, emission, that's it. So now everything is prepared. Render is prepared. Now let's do it. Render the image and wait. While it's rendering, you can open up this here to see what you get, if this is important for you. Okay, and then we can now escape out, go to Compositing, and now we have our render layers with all our passes. Let's check really fast if everything worked like expected. So this here are our moving objects. I want to see the objects themselves. Great. Then we want to have the ambient occlusion of them, the direct, the indirect, and the colors. Seems fine for me. That seems to work. The mist pass is exactly like we've prepared it. And if we go to depth, you see everything is white because this is not normalized. So you get really big values here. But this looks good for me. Alpha is also there. Yeah, we see the alpha here, but check this. This here, again, the same list. So the UVs here, for example, vector, nothing there because we haven't moved anything here. The normals are there, depth. Yeah, and then here, the last one is this here. So I think we are ready to go. You have seen how to mix everything here, how to make the setup. Don't forget, if you want to output now something like this, that not only the viewer has to be connected, also the composite. So you can make this by hand or select here the alpha over. And if you have the node wrangler active, you can press the O key like output. And then this here is connected. And then you can save out your composite later. So this finishes this tutorial. I hope you learned again something useful. If you like this kind of tutorials and you want to support me, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, or you also can be a Patreon. I would be really happy. If you have more questions, please write them in the comments. And yeah, we see each other in the next and last tutorial about the compositor. My name is Helge Maus from Pixeltrain. Have fun with Blender.